everyone, my name is Lindsay Wasser, and today we're going to be talking about the Treaty of Versailles and its relation to World War II. So after the ending of World War II, a question arose asking if the cause of World War II was the Treaty of Versailles Agreement. In order to answer this question, it's necessary to have an understanding of the background of the Treaty of Versailles. After learning about the history of the Treaty of Versailles, we will look at several historians' positions on this question in order to determine if the Treaty of Versailles was responsible for World War II or not. The Treaty of Versailles was signed at the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles, Paris in January 1919, following World War I. According to the U.S. Department of State, the purpose of the Paris Peace Conference was to establish peace between countries that were involved in World War I. There were four countries that essentially dominated the decision to create the Treaty of Versailles. These four countries were known as the Big Four and consisted of the United Kingdom, France, the United States, and Italy. The treaty discussed the compromise made by the nations at the conference. The largest aspect of the treaty was the planned formation of the League of Nations, which would serve as an international forum and collective security arrangement. The current U.S. President at the time, Woodrow Wilson, believed that the League of Nations would prevent future wars, but we see that this was not the case as there was actually a Second World War. Although the Paris Peace Treaty did lead to a signed agreement known as the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. Department of State explains that the development of the negotiations were difficult and complicated. This is because the UK, France, and Italy all fought together in World War I as the Allied powers, but the U.S. entered as an associate power. This meant that the U.S. was not bound to honor pre-existing agreements among the Allied powers, many of which the U.S. President disagreed with. It is apparent that the negotiations of the treaty were also weakened because of the absence of other important nations at the conference. For instance, Russia fought during World War I as one of the Allies until the new Bolshevik government withdrew from the war. This caused for the Allied powers to refuse to recognize the new Bolshevik government of Russia and refuse to invite Russia representatives to the peace conference. In addition to leaving out Russia from the agreement, the treaty subjected Germany to harsh punishments. The treaty forced Germany to surrender 10% of its pre-war territory in Europe and overseas possessions, as well as limiting the German army and navy size. Germany ended up having to accept the responsibility for World War I and became liable to pay the reparations to the Allies. As you can see, although the Treaty of Versailles established some peace between different nations, there were still some nations that got the short end of the stick, which would be Russia and Germany. Now that we understand the history of the Treaty of Versailles, it is important to review the debate of the question asked earlier. Was the Treaty of Versailles responsible for World War II? Derek Aldcroft and Mark Mazower are two historians who have opposite views on this debate. Aldcroft argues that the Treaty of Versailles left major issues unresolved and caused Germany to be bitter and resentful. On the other hand, Mazower argues that the Treaty of Versailles did a credible job and created a model world order under which Europe still lives today. We will begin the discussion of the debate by focusing on Aldcroft's article titled "The Versailles Legacy." In this article, Aldcroft provides many examples of how the treaty caused more problems within Europe rather than fixing the problems that already existed, which is what essentially led to World War II. Firstly, Aldcroft explains that the Versailles peace settlement gave Germany horrible penalties, which we previously discussed. But to mention them again, the penalties that Germany was faced with include the loss of territory and resources in Europe and across seas, a large bill for the compensation of the damage from World War I, and the loss of military and Allied occupation of key zones in Germany. For these reasons, it is understandable that Germany had resentment towards the winners of World War I and were determined to plot revenge. According to Aldcroft, Germany claimed that they were incapable of paying the large reparations bill and resorted to the printing press to prove their incapacity to pay. This led to a domino effect that affected many people in Germany. The result was major inflation in Germany, which contributed more to the disintegration of democracy than any other factor. In addition, the people of Germany were angry because their savings were basically destroyed. This was because their money wasn't worth as much as it was prior to the inflation. This anger resulted in the emergence of small political parties, also known as splinter parties, that were made of interest groups. This caused political instability and a shift in voter preference. Aldcroft suggests that the people in these smaller political parties made up a significant amount of the Nazi Party's electoral support. In addition to the hardships that occurred for Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty did not state any plans to reconstruct Europe. Aldcroft explains that there was not any effort made to improve the future prosperity of Europe. Plans clearly should have been made to improve Europe because by the mid-1920s, the industrial output remained below the levels that occurred in 1913, and this was leading to economic issues. Continuing with the economic issues that occurred in Europe following the treaty, Europe had a flawed international monetary system. Different countries within Europe stabilized their currencies when it best suited them. This meant that the countries of Europe had different currency systems, which caused a largely unworkable system of exchange rates within Europe. As you can see from the evidence Aldcroft provided, the Treaty of Versailles was created without the intent to improve Europe as a whole. Instead, each of the allies had their own country in mind, which led to disagreements between different countries and unfair settlements. Next, we will discuss Mazauer's argument and analyze the information that he provides in order to determine which historian holds a stronger position. Moving on to Mazauer's argument, he debates that the Treaty of Versailles did not cause World War II. As we review the points he makes to support his position, you will see that he tends to focus more on the reasons as to why the treaty was developed and the point that there really wasn't another good option. In my opinion, Mazauer does not provide the facts to show how the treaty benefited Europe or address the problems of nationalism, which was essentially caused by each country in Europe competing to be the most powerful. Mazauer explains that many scholars claim that the Treaty of Versailles was over-ideological or far-fetched, but he disagrees with this. Mazauer believes that the treaty was supposed to be an anti-communist crusade to contain the spread of Bolshevism. He elaborates on this point by explaining that the European liberals lost their enthusiasm for defending the Versailles Order because they were outflanked by other and more determined and forceful anti-communist movements. This point actually proves that Mazauer's wrong when he states that the treaty was not over-ideological, which it clearly was if it was overshadowed by other anti-communist movements. In addition, Mazauer states that the power of nationalism was the main political factor facing the architects of a new post-war settlement. He further explains that the Treaty of Versailles tackled the problems of nationalism better than fascism and communism. I do not find this statement to be credible because Mazauer fails to provide examples of how the treaty improved Europe as a whole. Finally, Mazauer ends his article by stating that there was no palatable alternative to Europe then or since, meaning that there was no other option than to develop the Treaty of Versailles. Even though this may be the case, that does not take away the fact that the treaty was made of unfair negotiations between some of the nations within Europe, mainly Germany, which led to hostility and anger. So now it's time to ask the question, who holds the stronger position, Aldcroft or Mazauer? As you might have been able to tell from my analysis of Aldcroft and Mazauer's arguments, I believe that Aldcroft holds the stronger position because of the information he provided to support his claim that the Treaty of Versailles was responsible for World War II. Another historian by the name of Frank McDonough wrote a book titled The Origins of the Second World War: An International Perspective. The first chapter of this book is titled The Versailles Settlement: The Start of the Road to the Second World War. In this chapter, McDonough explains how the Treaty of Versailles contributed to World War II, which supports Aldcroft's position. Firstly, McDonough begins this chapter by sharing statements from other historians who all agreed that the Treaty of Versailles inevitably led to World War II because of the harsh terms Germany was faced with. McDonough reiterates a statement made by a British soldier that explains the Treaty of Versailles very nicely. He said, "After the war to end war, they seem to have been pretty successful in Paris at making a peace to end peace. This means that World War I was supposed to be the last war, but instead it led to the Treaty of Versailles, which caused World War II." McDonough ends the chapter by explaining that the Treaty of Versailles presented harsh settlements to Germany, which essentially caused Germany to have anger and resentment towards the rest of Europe. He further explains that World War II might have been avoided if Germany accepted the settlement as fair and agreed to becoming a good European neighbor. If this was the case, the peacemakers might have recognized that the settlement needed to be adjusted and different compromises would have been made. To conclude, with all of the information that has been provided, it is easy to see that the Treaty of Versailles did in fact lead to World War II because of the unfair settlement towards Germany. Germany became resentful towards the rest of Europe for essentially blaming them for the war, which led Britain and France to declare war against Germany in order to prevent them from gaining revenge against the rest of Europe. It is unfortunate that the intention of the Treaty of Versailles was to produce peace in Europe, but it did the exact opposite. I hope that with the information I have provided you, you will be able to decide which position you agree with. Thank you.